Madet. My name is Salima Jivani, and I will be the moderator for today's Critical Conversation. The Critical Conversation series has been conceived as an ITREB USA initiative aimed at engaging the entire Jamaat, but with a focus on 18 to 40-year-olds. The series aims to explore the critical questions of our time within the context of our faith. Before we begin, in the spirit of social justice, land acknowledgement, and recognizing the history and exploitation of Indigenous peoples, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the ancestral lands of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar in the Los Angeles Basin. Each of us on this call today are speaking from territories of various Indigenous peoples and tribes, some treated and some unceded. We believe the work we do in sessions like these are part of our ongoing responsibility to acknowledge the ongoing harm that is done to Indigenous peoples on these lands, and working towards a society that is more just, equitable, and in keeping with the ethics as Ismaili Muslims. Today, we are talking about voting and faith, climate change. Today's session will provide an opportunity for us to explore the concept of environmental justice and how climate change is understood through different lenses. Our roles as Khalifas on the earth and the concept of protection that we see embedded in our faith, and how vulnerable populations intersect with environmental justice. During this session, you will also see a Q&A box which you can share additional questions or thoughts during the presentation. We will try to address as many questions submitted during today's talk as we can. With that, let me introduce you to our wonderful panelists briefly. Rozina Kanchwala. Rozina is an energy and environmental professional with nearly 15 years of global academic and work experience in the environmental sector. She is a Fulbright scholar. She spent a year in India studying agrarian distress and then completed GPISH and her master's degree in environment and sustainable development in the UK. She serves as the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Manager for the Clean Energy Leadership Institute in Washington, D.C. Rozina wrote and produced a play called Love in the Time of Climate Change that was met with success, leading her to realize that there is a real appetite for environmental education that is educational and inspiring. The play and her years doing environmental education work led her to start a nonprofit called Ecological. Through this organization, Rozina aims to help people find solutions to the climate crisis. Prior to finding Ecological, Rozina worked in the solar energy industry, doing education and advocacy work with a focus on energy justice. Zohra Ismail Beben is an environmental anthropologist currently living in Kazakhstan. She has a graduate degree from Indiana University. Her work is based in Central Asia and looks at the intersection of climate change, politics of natural resources, global development, disaster risk management, and exploring ethnographically the vulnerabilities of mountain communities. She is currently working on her book manuscript entitled Disaster State, Tajikistan and the Neoliberal Perceptions of Central Asia. She has done extensive ethnographic fieldwork in Tajikistan and Kazakhstan, drawing on her background in mapping and geographic information systems. She is currently the co-PI of a project, Mapping the Sacred Geography of Kazakhstan, and the founder of qualitative, ecological, and social risk mapping consulting firm EthnoRisk. She is busy working on an interfaith podcast project, The Faithful Anthropologist, with her two fellow anthropologists who are interested in exploring the role of faith in our personal and professional lives. Her primary identity is that of an educator, and she has taught many university courses over the years on disasters, development, climate change, and GIS. She is also an LWISA and a graduate of the International WISEing Training Program. At the outset, we would like to note that the views of our speakers expressed during the course of this discussion are their own. Let us now turn to the conversation. Could you share some details about your background and how you are connected to the field of climate change and environmental justice?
Sure. So I'll take the lead on this. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and my focus is on global environmental change and its effects on local communities in Central Asia. So when I traveled to the Pamirs for the first time almost 15 years ago, what I saw immediately was the vulnerability that confronts mountain communities each and every day. And it's only been exacerbated by climate change, right? So on the one hand, we see things like glacial lake outburst floods that can devastate and displace communities. On the other hand, ironically enough, right, there's not enough water for agriculture because there's decreased glacial melt, and essentially one of the biggest effects of global warming. So what I see is that these communities are confronting disasters. And as anthropologist of disaster, Anthony Oliver Smith famously said, there is no such thing as a natural disaster. Human communities have lived with hazards for as long as humanity has existed. But disasters are always the result of social, economic, and political forces, right? Hence this idea that disasters are always unnatural. We see this, right now globally. This is not just a frontline mountain issue anymore. We see this with the COVID-19 pandemic. We're all having to confront this, which is to say that we see with our own eyes that a disaster like a pandemic doesn't affect all communities equally. It doesn't affect everybody equally. The COVID-19 pandemic in the United States has had a disproportionate, disastrous effect on communities of color, on poor people, people who lack resources in terms of healthcare. So we see that these disasters, for me, seeing that in Tajikistan, even, 10, 15 years ago, and of course today, so these disasters are not of their own making, the climate-related disasters. They're not of their making. They're being driven by nations such as China and the United States, which together, just these two nations contribute 40% of the global emissions that is leading to global warming. So these are not future problems. And I work with frontline communities. These are here and now problems. This is happening right now. And climate change is, to my mind, the most dire existential crisis that humanity has ever faced. So Rozina, would you jump in?
Sure, yes. So hello, everyone. I just want to also start by acknowledging that I am currently physically on the ancestral lands of the Osage, Caddo, and Ocheti-Sakowin tribes. I've been working in the environmental space for many years, and I also sort of had my aha moment where I really saw the human face of climate change when I was in India. So, I was there for about a year studying agrarian distress, which is actually just a nice way to say farmer suicides. And it was then that I really saw up close the effects climate change was having on these farming communities. So yes, there were a lot of different problems. There were, you know, faulty seeds that were being sold, pesticide companies taking advantage, you know, the inability to get formal loans, but unpredictable rainfall was really at the heart of the issues where farmers were not able to grow their crops. And in some dire situations, they ended up drinking their last bottle of pesticide, which didn't work because there was no rainfall. And so for me, that was sort of the human face of climate change, where it is here and now, as Zohra mentioned. It's not something in the distant future. It's not just affecting polar bears, which it is doing that too, but it really is impacting people. So after my time in India, I went on to the GPISH program in the UK and then completed my master's in environment and sustainable development. And then I came to the US, started working in the solar energy world. And for part of my time working in the solar energy world, I was focused on I was working with an organization focused on making solar technology available and accessible to all communities. A lot of times we think of solar and renewable energy as unaffordable, inaccessible, and so this organization was really focused on how can we provide solar to all communities, because it's important to recognize that low-income communities pay a much higher portion of their income on electricity compared to higher income communities. And so the benefits in some ways of solar go so much further on low-income communities. So that's one aspect of the work that I was focused on. And then the organization was also focused on workforce development in those communities. So it's one thing to, you know, make solar accessible, but then let's train people to get the skills to join the green economy so that when we do transition to a clean energy economy, it really is an inclusive economy that includes all people. Because for so long, especially in the US, it has been marginalized groups, low-income communities, communities of color that have been located in areas close to polluting power plants. So all the electricity that we use, yes, it is impacting all of us in terms of global emissions, but the direct impacts are felt much higher on these marginalized communities. So when we think about transitioning to the clean energy economy, it really is important to keep all communities in mind. So that's some of the work that I've been doing in the environmental and energy space. And then, as was mentioned, most recently started an organization called Ecological, which really is you know, meant to educate people about climate change, but also include everyone in the movement. So that's just a quick little bit background on me.
Thank you, Zohra and Rozina, for sharing a little bit about yourselves. To get us started in this conversation, could you help us with some basic definitions, like what is climate change?
Sure, I'll start. So I also want to talk about global warming and climate change. So often these terms are used interchangeably. They are actually two different things. So global warming refers to the global temperature of the planet, so the average global temperature. So you can look up graphs and you'll see that for millennia, the average temperature of the planet sort of hovered at a certain temperature. And with the Industrial Revolution, we started emitting greenhouse gases, and the global temperature has has steadily risen. So that's global warming. It's just the average temperature of the planet. And then climate change refers to the long-term change in average weather patterns that have come to define the Earth's local or regional climates. So an example would be rainfall in a certain area, or ocean patterns in a certain area. So global warming is sort of the average global temperature, and it affects climate change.
Got it. Oh, go ahead, Zohra.
Thanks, Salima. So I just want to add that there are a couple of, well, there are many myths around climate change. It is scientifically complex issue, but I just want to address a couple of these myths, just put that out there from the outset. One of the main myths that come up is that climate change has always existed, right? So Earth has gone through these glacial ages, right? And this is natural variability. We're just dealing with natural variability. Well, sure, there is natural variability, but that natural variability takes 100,000 years, not 100 years. So that natural variability pattern has actually been disrupted. And what we see is that something, and we know that something is human made, right? Emissions is causing the pattern to essentially be 1,000 times faster than it would be if it was only natural variability. Okay, so so we know that is not simply an issue of natural variability, of Earth's climate changing over its long environmental history. There is more going on here, and that is the anthropogenic forces that are causing the climate to change. Another one is, why are there colder periods? Why do we see colder periods? If it's global warming, right? Then why does it get cold sometimes? And what, there's some confusion about what, there's another one, right? Like, we can't predict the weather 5 days out. How can you talk about what the climate is going to do 100 years out? Right? I think these two are related. And the idea here is that you basically have two different measures. These are two different things. Climate and weather are not the same thing. Climate is a long-term averages, right? It's an issue of long-term averages of temperatures. And those long-term averages are a lot more predictable than weather forecasting, which is an inherently chaotic system, right? So we can predict these long-term averages, and the long-term averages are telling us that this is going towards warming, global warming. So you might see these dips, right, where you might have cold periods and warm periods, but the long-term average is showing us that the climate is indeed changing, and we're experiencing global warming. The last one I'm just going to quickly take is, what is the big deal about 2 degrees of warming? Okay, so it's 2 degrees. Doesn't sound like that much, right? Doesn't sound problematic. But for many reasons, I'm not going to go into all of them here, climate change and global warming in particular cause runaway effects. So glacier melts and melting that's happening of the polar ice caps is essentially trapping heat, and all the melting is causing more melting to occur. So it becomes a runaway cycle, right? Where the oceans are rising, coastal areas are being flooded, becoming uninhabitable. There are more intense disasters, heat waves, droughts, wildfires, intense storms. So these cycles are going to continue, and that 2-degree warming is going to, we're not actually even there anymore, right? We're actually looking at much more warming than those 2 degrees. So that I just wanted to briefly address some of those myths about climate change.
Thank you for explaining that. And then I think another term we would like to define would be environmental justice.
So environmental justice, to my mind, is deeply connected with climate change. Environmental justice essentially combines the concerns around the environment with concerns about social justice and inequality. And a famous sociologist, Ulrich Beck, said that in the modern world, in a world that is defined by climate change, we have to focus on not just the distribution of goods globally, but the distribution of bads. And when we look at the distribution of risk, what we see is that there are deep community level, nation level, and global ecological and economic inequalities. So for example, Paul, I believe, Mohai, that's right. Paul Mohai, who is a very well-known scholar of environmental justice, talks about the Flint, Michigan water crisis, right? And he points to this as one of the grave environmental injustices to have ever taken place in the United States. And when you look at this water crisis that happened, that essentially led to lead contamination in the Flint water, affecting families, children, communities in and around Flint, you basically see a disproportionate impact on communities of color and poor people. And Rozina went through examples from her own work, right? And as I mentioned, in Tajikistan, the communities that are experiencing these effects, right, are the communities with the least amount of power and the least amount of resources to deal with these issues, to deal with these really life and death concerns. Not to mention concerns about displacement, about livelihood. So environmental justice, I would say, is two things. It's both the academic field of understanding how communities are affected, whether it's around race, national origin, how communities are disproportionately affected by climate change and global warming. And it's also activist work, essentially to try to reduce these inequalities and to try to create more fairness in our air and water pollution standards, and trying to essentially not have all this burden be placed on the communities that can least afford it.
Yeah, I might just add to that. So I think it's the EPA that defines environmental justice as the fair and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, when it comes to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And unfortunately, we're not seeing that. So, you know, we already have a system that's unfair from the onset. And then when these climate disasters strike, well, you know, we really need to look at climate change from this social justice lens to think about the compounding impacts that are being brunt by certain communities who are already marginalized and now as a result are facing these extra burdens. So for example, you know, we can talk about Hurricane Katrina, for instance, right? The communities most impacted in Hurricane Katrina were communities that didn't have access to transportation, so they couldn't get out. That was one thing, right? Another thing is, well, let's look at, you know, the communities and proximity to power plants again. So in the aftermath, the water and air was polluted with these toxic substances. And so, you know, even in the aftermath, well, who's continuing to be impacted? So there's just a lot of layers, and I think climate change really needs to be looked at from this social justice lens. And I think environmental justice kind of is the intersection, as Zohra said, of environmental issues and social justice issues.
and it's a human face, right? So it's our neighbors and our friends and people in the Ismaili communities in Tajikistan and, you know, other frontline communities that are essentially bearing the brunt of what's happening.
Definitely. Thank you for that explanation. So can you please share with us, what does it mean to be a Khalifa of the earth and all living things? How is environmental activism connected to Islam?
So I think as Muslims, when we talk about our role as Khalifa, our love of nature, of earth, of the environment, of being the stewards of that, that is all coming from the ultimate recognition of Allah as the creator. And it is through that relationship that we are ultimately seeing our creation, our fellow creation, the creation of Earth itself as a gift to humanity. You know, one of my favorite projects from the Award for Architecture, Akan Award for Architecture, was one that on the face of it doesn't even look like a architectural project, you know, not one you imagine of a building, right? And it was essentially a project of reforesting and regreening this campus space in Ankara, Turkey. So the award for Akan Award for Architecture, the idea behind this was essentially to create this sense, the spirit that we coexist with nature, that we do not attempt to overpower or dominate nature. And I think that that is also the heart of Islam as a faith. Another thing that I think we've come to recognize is that, especially in fields like environmental education, as Rozina mentioned, is that climate change is not simply a scientific or technical problem. It is a deeply moral problem. It's a deeply philosophical problem. And we're not going to solve it merely through scientific or technical means. We're going to have to think fundamentally differently about life on Earth, about our relationships with other human beings and with other species, plants and animals. There's a quote by Hazrat Ali alayhi salam that says, "Be like a bee. Anything he eats is clean, anything he drops is sweet, and any branch he sits upon does not break," right? I think that's a great adage for having a low carbon footprint, that essentially we need to think about this as individuals. And as individuals, if we think about how much we consume in the United States, it would take 6 planet Earths for everybody else in the world to consume the way we do. So as individuals, we need to think about what the Quran is telling us, not just about being a Khalifa, right? But also about not being wasteful, not committing israf, not spreading corruption, fasad, which itself could be a whole session about what spreading corruption on the land means, you know, politically, ecologically, you know, in many, many different ways. And to not upset the balance, the mizan, right? So that is on an individual level, but that's not enough. That is not nearly enough. What we really need to do is change our private and public institutions. We need to change our governments, corporations. We need to fundamentally change capitalism itself, right? Which is the economic system under which we all live, right? There are colonial relationships that have created a world of haves and have-nots. And it's also created a view of nature that is, nature is something to be overpowered, something to be dominated through human mastery. And the Imam himself warns us. There's a speech for the Akan Award for Architecture from 2019, where he warns us to understand our limitations and the limitations of human mastery, and not to approach nature through that lens of mastery.
Yeah, all really well said. I'm just going to add some things. So I also teach REC, and last week we did a session on civic engagement. So when you're asking about, you know, our faith and the role of, you know, sort of activism, I'm just going to point to a speech that I shared with my students last week. It's a speech by Maulana Hazri Imam. It's a commencement speech in 2006 where he's talking about the democratic systems, and he says our challenge is not to find alternatives to democracy, but to find more and better ways to make democracy work. So kind of building off of what Zohra said, you know, it's we need to hold our institutions accountable in a sense. So you know, I think we're talking about voting today. So voting is sort of step one of so many steps, right? It's not enough just to vote for the candidate that you think is going to, you know, take action or whatever. It's once they're elected, how do we continue to hold them accountable? So I think it's just really important that, you know, it is our civic duty to be engaged in the democratic process and, you know, continue to improve that democratic process. So I'll just kind of say that for now.
Thank you. So can you tell us how you have understood environmental protection to be connected to the practice of your faith?
Sure, yeah, I can start with this one. You know, Hazri Imam has made so many speeches that mention the fact that we have a responsibility to care for the planet. And he's also mentioned that we're increasingly going to see situations where global warming will cause risks in places that weren't at risk before. So the Imam has made speeches, you know, a lot with his award for architecture. There's a lot there talking about environmental stewardship and responsibility and our relationship with nature. And then also within the Akkadian framework, there's a long history of environmental conservation. So the faith connection is crystal clear to me. And when we, you know, we grow up talking about how Islam is a way of life. And I think that really extends to how we care for the planet, how we care for the people. And again, these two things are intertwined. So, you know, it's very clear that our faith calls upon us to be protectors of the environment and to be stewards of the environment and to care for the people. Again, I think that's just really important. It's not just, you know, the animals, which that alone should be important enough for us to care about, but it really is the people that are also impacted.
Oh, should I add to this?
Yes, if you have some thoughts, Zohra, we would love to hear it.
I think for my faith, personally, I believe that my faith propels me to deal with the world as it is now, and to not try to airbrush the truth because it's inconvenient or uncomfortable or doesn't fit with how we like to think of ourselves. One of the ways in which this has always been brought home to me, especially when it comes to climate change, is essentially observing these interactions of local communities in Tajikistan and in Kazakhstan, where I've done a lot of ethnographic field work. I observed the interactions between these communities and outsiders, whether they were, you know, development folks, government people who came in periodically, right? Experts of every stripe. And and they use this phrase called knowledge transfer. And to me, knowledge transfer essentially sounds like we'll do the talking and you listen. We'll tell you how it works, how things should be, how things ought to be. And this particular problem, climate change, is, I think, meant to be, as I said, it's a moral problem, but I'm hoping that it's also a humbling one, because it requires that change happen among the elites and not among the poorest communities that are facing this burden. So environmental justice, which to me is connected with my faith, is essentially listening to these communities, listening to their experiences of adaptation, in many cases of not being able to adapt, to not be able to continue to live in the places in which they've lived, right? And listening to the way that their ecology is fundamentally changing and fundamentally making it difficult, if not impossible, for them to continue to live where they live now, to continue to extract their livelihoods, right? So it's also understanding my privilege. I think all of us can benefit from this, benefit from understanding our own positionality, our own privilege vis-a-vis others, whether they're in the community, within the community, or outside the community. And I think for me, that's that listening, that really reflecting on that privilege is part and parcel of that connection with faith.
Thank you for sharing those thoughts. How have both of you understood climate change to be perceived, and what kinds of obstacles have you faced with misinformation and disinformation?
I will start with that. So we live in the age of the internet, in the age of social media, and so information travels so quickly. And the downside of that is that false information travels so quickly. And so this is definitely a challenge when it comes to climate change, because there are people who don't, quote unquote, believe in it as if it's something that, you know, as if there are two sides when there's really not two sides. And that's a result of special interests, right? Including fossil fuel companies that have spent so billions of dollars and years spreading misinformation, injecting doubt, and causing confusion. And as long as there's confusion and doubt, that delays action. And so we've seen that before with cigarette companies, right? The science was clear, cigarettes cause cancer. But for years, they would pay doctors to speak out about you know, how it's not actually bad for you, or they would hide reports that come out, they would buy out reports. And so the fossil fuel company is taking from that exact same playbook, causing doubt, causing misinformation. And I've even seen a little bit in the chat some of what's going on. I just clicked on one of the links, and the first thing that came up, it was something from the Heartland Institute. So I would suggest you dig into that and look into who's funding the Heartland Institute. It is the Koch brothers, and that, you know, they have fossil fuel interests. So there's a lot of misinformation. And I will just say that I would recommend looking at the IPCC. It's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it's sort of the leading authority on the subject. So there is scientific consensus on this, and we know that climate change is happening. It is human caused, it is urgent, and we have about 10 years to act if we want to avoid runaway climate change. So you know, there's a lot of misinformation. I think that it's really unfortunate that it's become politicized, that it's become, you know, two sides of a debate. There is no debate. So just gonna say that. And You know, I think it's also just challenging. I think social media has a large part to play in spreading this because they are more concerned about clicks than they are about, you know, true information, and mainstream media as well. You know, we've seen these disastrous wildfires, we've seen hurricanes, we've seen droughts, rainfalls, all these things, but very rarely do we hear climate change when we learn about these weather events. And so yes, wildfires are natural, they occur, but climate change is making them so much worse. The same goes with hurricanes. You know, hurricanes are becoming much more frequent, much more severe, and it is a result of climate change. So I think the media has a role to play in not talking about climate change, not stating it, not addressing it. And there was a stat that I just saw, it was that only 25% of Americans hear about global warming in the media at least once a week. And for the magnitude of the challenge, that's just not enough. We need to be talking about it a lot more so that we can understand it and we can address it. So yeah, unfortunately, misinformation is a really big problem, but yeah.
Well, and you know, you talk about cigarette makers. You started with them, right? And what's interesting and frankly very sad is that once they weren't able to peddle their untruths in the United States, once they were sued for millions and millions of dollars, they essentially took their business and their lies and their, you know, untruths to the global market, right? So they're actually working very hard in other countries, essentially trying to do what they were trying to do in the United States, which is cast doubt on the most clear science you can get, right? Most clear science you can get, that cigarettes cause cancer. And that is as clear a science as we have on climate change. Humans cause climate change. When we talk about scientific consensus, we have to talk about what science is. And I have to do this every time I start my course, right, on introduction to climate change or introduction to disasters, right, is the first thing we do is we talk about what is science and how do we understand scientific consensus. When you talk about something that scientists say 99% or 99.9% of the scientists say this is the way it is. In science, that is as close to the truth with a capital T as you're going to get, right? So a lot of these kind of disinformation, misinformation campaigns essentially count on people not understanding the nature of scientific knowledge itself and what science is, right? So there's that gap, right, that we have to address as educators, right? How does science work? How does basic science work? As much as I love the IPCC, Rozina, I feel like to be able to understand the report, I think to be able to make sense of it, you need a basic scientific understanding. And I think, unfortunately, some of that might be missing. What's also missing, I think, is how do we assess knowledge? Not all knowledge is created equal, right? So as Rozina mentioned, social media makes things a lot worse. It makes it much harder to sort of wade through and figure out what to believe. And sociologically, what we've seen is how this is playing out. I'm happy to share academic resources on this, but right now, where we are sociologically is we're saying educated people, you know, college, university educated people who are falling for conspiracy theories. And there's a nexus, an entanglement that's happened around, you know, and I'm talking about educated parents, educated communities, falling for things like anti-vaccination campaigns, right? And these anti-vaccination campaigns have this relationship with, organic living, clean living lifestyles. And these are also connected to climate skepticism. And so we're seeing this kind of complex entanglements play out. But what I just want to say is that, and these communities start to overlap on Facebook, for example, where the same groups or groups that are peddling climate skepticism come to overlap with anti-vaccination groups, and so there's a very complex phenomenon here, not just scientifically but sociologically. But just to say that these conspiracy theories are showing us something. They're showing us that that this is a complex problem with not that humans are causing climate change. That, please don't get me wrong, I don't mean to say that there's any doubt about that. But how are we going to deal with that as individuals, as communities, as societies? How is that going to play out when there are going to be difficult choices about the climate refugees that are going to be created, that already are created? There are entire communities that have become climate refugees, right? So there's going to be tough political and policy decision making that's going to have to happen. And I think that the misinformation is only going to increase. It's going to get more sophisticated, and it's going to start becoming, it's going to start coming into our feeds, our Facebook feeds, or probably already is, our Twitter feeds. It's going to start coming in ways that we may not recognize immediately as climate disinformation. But it's all about trying to inject that doubt, because doubt delays action, as Rozina said. And there are a lot of groups and a lot of people for whom that doubt is very crucial to continuing the business as usual, because their profits depend on it, their version of capitalism that is exclusive, that keeps a lot of, that has only increased inequality around the world. They benefit from it personally. So the more they can muddle things and make people doubt, the better for them. And I think that, as Rozina said, we have to remember, we have to ask the question, who is funding this research? Who stands to benefit and gain? These are the matters of critical thinking, of using our akal or intellect, if you want to bring it back to our faith, right? And to how we are supposed to essentially engage as Ismaili Muslims, through our intellect. I mean, they're critical questions that need to be asked.
Great. And I know that we briefly mentioned this, but can we dig a little bit deeper and talk about how certain segments of the community are disproportionately affected by climate change? And what are some examples of intersection of climate change and vulnerable populations?
Rozina, would you like to jump in on this? Sure. So yeah, we did mention it a little bit. I will just point out, I'll speak to what's called Cancer Alley in this country. Basically, it's an 85-mile stretch from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, and it is lined with oil and gas and petrochemical plants. And, there's a reason it's called Cancer Alley. Most of the population there has cancer. Most of the population there is Black. And so, again, just, when we talk about marginalized communities, this is one example that we can point to where, because of the history of redlining, because of, the political invisibility of these communities, you could say. Petrochemical plants came, placed their plants there, and had very little consequence, right? And so I think, when we talk about the impacts, the compounding impacts, right? When we could talk about COVID, or we could talk about, when disaster strikes. Well, COVID, for example, communities that for years have been marginalized, have been suffering health consequences because of these deliberate, systematic decisions, now are more vulnerable in the face of a disaster like COVID. So I just think it points to the fact that, we can't separate the two, environmental issues and social justice. They really are hand in hand. So I think that's one example. Again, when disaster strikes these communities that have been marginalized, well, we have to think about, like, do they have access to transportation? Do they have social safety nets? Do they have, insurance? Do they, like, what are all the factors? And then also just the geographical location of where they are. So just one example of so many we can point to.
Right. And, I have this background behind me. So clearly I wish I was there, but I'm not. I'm sitting in a room in my home. It's an image of the Pamir Mountains. In particular, if you're interested, it's the Bartang Valley. It's an image that I took during one of my fieldwork trips. And just coming back to where I started, the communities that are being affected by climate change are mountain communities, are island communities, are communities of color in places like the United States, Black communities in particular, because they've been marginalized throughout American history. So it is the marginalized communities, both globally and for anybody who's sort of casually studied the power relationships, the global power relationships or colonialism, knows that, mountain communities are particularly peripheral and persecuted and lack power and lack resources. These are the frontline communities who are dealing with issues of climate change in the here and now. And these communities stand to lose their livelihoods and their lives when there is a flood due to glacier melt, when the glaciers become so unstable that there's an outburst flood. Right? These communities, these are Ismaili communities in Tajikistan that are either displaced or they lose everything, and they don't have much, but they lose their homes, they lose their animals, they lose their fields. So every little bit they have, and in many, in cases, their lives as well. And they're the canaries in the coal mine for all of us. They're bearing the brunt so all of us can see what is happening. The United States is very interesting from the perspective of risk of climate change. And the reason for that is cultural. In the United States, coastal areas in other parts of the world, for example, in India, in Bangladesh, are often, coastal communities are often fisher communities that are marginal communities. They live off of the sea, and there's very little that, they're not making big profits, right? It's a survival existence. So in the United States, coastal communities tend to be rich communities. Rich people tend to build on coastal lands. And there are a lot of gleaming hotels and all sorts of evidence of this, right? And what's happening now is that we are trying to solve this. We're trying to solve this in a technical way. We're trying to create even higher seawalls to protect these communities, especially because a lot of elites live there and they want their view, right? Their ocean view. So building bigger seawalls is not going to help, right? It didn't help in Katrina, and it's not going to help us face this. Bigger, higher, more money, we're going to hit a limit. So I tend to think of these vulnerable communities both as vulnerable in the way that we need to think about their lives, we need to think about what they're facing, but also as the canaries in the coal mine. They're facing it today, now, this minute. They're facing this danger, these challenges. For the rest of us, maybe we can postpone it a little bit longer, thinking about it, but not too much longer, right? And we see this with the pandemic. This pandemic was exacerbated by climate change. We are essentially involved in, so climate change is one effect, right? Global warming, global emissions is one effect of capitalism. But the other effects that are interrelated are effects like habitat destruction. Right? And pandemics happen because we end up in habitats in which we don't belong, which is exactly what happened here. So we are essentially, we're talking about vulnerable communities, but the point is we're all vulnerable. And we have very little time left. There's not an endless amount of goodwill, I guess, from Earth towards us, and we need to start working on this problem yesterday. So I hope that that we can start listening to the stories, if it helps, from our Smiley brothers and sisters in India, in Bangladesh, in Tajikistan. Let's listen to their stories. And they will tell us that climate change is very real. And they'll tell us what they're dealing with, every single day. If we don't want to listen to our Smiley brothers and sisters in California, like yourself, then, there are, people facing this each and every single day, and we're running out of time.
Thank you, Rozina and Zohra. So both of you have had a lot of experience in this area. Can you share some examples of addressing climate change and environmental justice that you have found particularly inspiring?
Sure, yeah. So I'll talk about within the institution. So as I mentioned, the AKDN has a long history of environmental conservation work. I worked in Kenya briefly with the Prince Sadruddin Aga Khan Fund for the Environment on a tree planting campaign. And the Prince Sadruddin Aga Khan Fund for the Environment, long name, there's a lot of emphasis on communities on the front lines of climate change, and attempts to address climate resilience really take into account the complete picture of how local communities live in their environment. So it was just really heartening to work with an organization. We were doing tree planting. There was a 2 million tree planting campaign in Kenya at the time, and it really was working with different community groups. And so that was just one example that I got to work with. And then more recently, in 2016, the Akan Agency for Habitat was established, and climate change is really part of the mission of the Akan Agency for Habitat. And they focus on disaster risk reduction, natural resource management, and climate smart construction. So that's sort of the Akan Agency for Habitat. And then the newest thing, which is very exciting, is the creation of the Environment and Climate Committee, the ECC, which is under the leadership of Prince Rahim. And so they'll work to direct the AKDN's effort to make climate change a central focus of its policies and programs throughout the network. And so they're formulating this AKDN-wide climate change strategy and will lead an AKDN greenhouse gas management and measurement initiative and offset program. So, you know, I think for years the AKDN institutions have been sort of doing climate related things in maybe a piecemeal way, and I think now there really is this understanding of how you know, we need to look at the issue holistically with centering communities in the work. So those are some really exciting and inspiring initiatives that are pretty new.
Yeah, and you know, so our institutions are doing a lot of good work, and you know, for me, I saw this particularly with Focus in Tajikistan. You know, Focus, it has a lot of respect both in the development community and in the local communities themselves, because they, I think, I'm not going to say more than everybody else. I mean, they're one of the main organizations operating in the mountain communities, but I think their focus is a holistic one. You know, they are trying to understand what these communities are dealing with, and trying to help create this resilience and create solutions and help these communities adapt to climate change in serious and important ways. And so I think that there are organizations and groups that are working on community resilience, community adaptation, and there are many different levels of work that can be done. This is not if you can't change capitalism, then just go take a nap because we're done. We can't, you know, where are we gonna go? You know, there are a lot of wonderful groups that are able to think with local communities. Or groups that local communities themselves are, you know, local communities themselves in Central America, for example, in South America, are creating, you know, social justice movements around environmental issues. And here in Kazakhstan, you know, one of the things we talk about is the former Soviet states often came together, whether it was in the Ukraine, whether it was in Kazakhstan, around issues of climate and around issues of environmental problems. And they created civic groups and citizen groups to address these issues in their local communities and with their governments. So there is a lot of good that is happening, and that is important to focus on as well. And one of the things that happens with climate change in particular is that it just seems like there's a lot of bad news. It's one of the most depressing things I teach, and we have to combat that fatalism, right? About you know, whether we can do something. Of course we can, and people are. And it's also up to us to go find those examples and join those efforts that are already happening.
Great. Thank you both for sharing some of your stories and experiences. Really appreciated it. But last but not least, our session is called Voting and Faith. So can you please tell us why it's important for the community to be aware of this issue when they're voting?
Yes.
Sure. I mean, voting has consequences, right? Because who we elect, of course, shows or demonstrates, right, what is important to us. What are our priorities? What do we think are the real challenges that our world is facing? I think that there are some real key challenges, policy challenges that are essentially in front of us today as Americans. One I would say is rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement. The Paris Climate Agreement, for those of you who have not heard of it, is probably the best attempt we've made as nations to come together and essentially curb emissions, set emissions targets to keep global warming to 2 degrees. And so these, so this agreement is an important one, and we are not part of it right now. So I think that becoming part of, joining the community of nations and becoming part of this agreement is, I think, an important challenge. Some of the other issues that I think we need to think about as we do vote and as we think about how we're going to vote, if we're looking at it from this perspective, the perspective of environmental justice, for example, our regulations, EPA regulations around air and water pollution, that instead of having been tightened, have actually been loosened a great deal and rescinded. Many regulations have been rescinded. So instead of, I think moving in the direction where we address these big challenges, we are taking the approach of denying or ignoring these challenges altogether, and some cases making it even worse. So I think looking at how, what role scientists have in policymaking, are our scientists being listened to, whether there are public health professionals or those who work in the environmental field, right, who work on climate change. Are they being silenced or are they being listened to? Are their recommendations being acted on? So these are the issues that I think people need to think about as they decide how to vote, because voting has consequences, and we have seen that over and over again. So whatever you do, vote, I think is what I would say. However you do it, at least reflect on priorities that are important to you. And hopefully Rozina and I have been able to bring this concern at least as one of the priorities that you might consider in thinking about how you will vote.
Yeah, I'll just add, you know, if it hasn't been made clear already, you know, climate change is an urgent threat. So there was an IPCC report a couple of years ago that basically said we have about 12 years left to act if we want to avert the worst impacts of climate change. And so sadly, we don't have another 4 years left to deny climate science. And you know, what we're seeing, these wildfires, these hurricanes, you know, all the climate disasters that we're seeing are a result of 1 degree global warming. So, you know, as Zohra said, the Paris Agreement is aspiring to 2 degrees. So we don't even know what is to come, right? And so, you know, even if we were to turn off all our emissions tomorrow, which we're not doing, we would continue to see climate disasters because there is an accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So it's just really important that we understand what's at stake, because there is a lot at stake right now. And so there's just an organization I'll point to. It's called the League of Conservation Voters, and they kind of score different candidates on their climate record. So I would just recommend checking that out. You know, if you want to become an informed voter on climate, there are a lot of really good resources, so you know exactly who you know agrees with what your views are. The other thing I'll say is, you know, in America, you know, we tend to tune in every 4 years to the federal election, which obviously this is a very consequential one. They always are, but we have midterm elections every year. And 2 years ago, we did have a record turnout in the midterm election, but our representatives at other levels are also very important. So make sure you know who your governor is, your mayor, your member of Congress, your city council member. There are so many levels of government, and it's not just, oh, you know, the presidential candidate, which that's important too, but there's a lot else on the ballot. So I would recommend just finding out what's on the ballot where you live. And yeah, there's a lot of resources out there to tell you what exactly is on the ballot. So I would just recommend, you know, being an informed voter. And again, voting is step one. There's just so much more to do even after that.
And yeah, I was just, you know, thank you for making that point, Rozina, right? Like a lot of the municipal elections are very, very consequential because a lot of the decision making around policies that will mitigate the effects of climate change are going to be made at that level, right? Whether to erect a seawall, for example, whether to, you know, what kind of mitigation measures will cities, you know, especially vulnerable coastal cities and areas, what mitigation measures they're going to take. That is all going to happen. That is going to come out of municipal budgets, and that's going to happen at the community level. So trying to understand, you know, we always talk about, okay, well, you know, we should think about where our money is going, where taxpayer dollars are going. And that starts at that level in terms of adaptation measures, mitigation measures that are, you know, that these are decisions that mayors are already facing, you know, governors are already facing. And so really understanding what they stand for and what their overall approach is to the climate change threat is, I think, very important. So yeah, I absolutely agree, Rozina. Yeah, thank you for making that point. That's really important.
Thank you, Zohra and Rozina, so much for those reflective thoughts, particularly through defining concepts related to environmental justice and climate change, and how this kind of protection is embedded within our faith. It is very clear that we need to be informed about this issue and its impact on vulnerable populations when voting in November. With everything that's been spoken about, we have received so many questions from our audience, which I'm sure we would love to hear your insights upon. With that, let's turn to our first question. Policy level systemic change takes time. What can we do at the community level that can make a change?
Rozina, would you like to?
Sure. Yeah, definitely policy level, policy change takes time. And I think, you know, that it sort of builds off of community building, right? So I don't think that it's one or the other. I think we start, I really think we just need to talk about climate change more. I think the media needs to mention it more. And we just need to have these conversations, because I think even when we look at like civil rights or other movements, right, it took so much grassroots mobilizing, so much building, so much talking about these issues before there was substantial change. And I think with climate change, similarly, we just need to talk about it so much more. We need to, you know, bring, you know, whether it's our Ismaili community, like talk about it within the RE curriculum. You know, it's easy to tie into because it is, as we mentioned, a part of our faith. So I think we just need to build, you know, understanding. We need to, you know, make sure that people get the correct information. There is so much information, including on this misinformation, including in this chat. And we just need to, you know, help people understand what is at stake, because so much is at stake. And then once enough people understand it, well, then they'll start demanding action of their elected officials. So you know, it kind of builds off of each other. There's a group I've been volunteering with for many years. It's called the Citizens Climate Lobby. I'm not going to go into their policy, but essentially it is just building, you know, they sort of look at 3 ways to build change. And one is really that grassroots organizing, talking to as many people, educating people about the science, like let's get people aware of the issue. And then there's lobbying our elected officials. So, you know, you can go to your member of Congress, and one thing that a member of Congress said was like, okay, great, well now convince my constituents to also talk to me about this, because if I don't hear it from my constituents, well, I'm not going to do anything about it, right? So it's like, let's build the movement, let's talk to our elected officials. And then also, like, there's a media lever, right? The more that it is in our everyday vocabulary, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. I think Zohra has a book recommendation, or an author recommendation, who talks about climate. And we just need to talk about it more. So I think that at the community level, there's a lot we can do. We didn't really talk about individual actions so much. Zohra brought it up with the low carbon footprint analogy. You know, there's a lot that individuals can do, but there's just so much more power in movements. And so finding organizations that are already doing the work, joining up with them. And, you know, I think that's the best way to make change.
You know, there are a lot of tenacious problems in the American, you know, in American history and American sociology, right? Like race. And we see what happens when people come together to essentially protest racial injustice. You know, people find a voice, and people find a way to become empowered. You know, one of the things that I was particularly heartened by was the people of faith coming together for the climate march in New York City in 2014. And it was faith leaders and people who, you know, believers of all the different religions, essentially coming together to press on the urgency of this issue. So this, you know, this collective action, these social movements can be built. And we see the results of that. And it does take a long time. And unfortunately, time is not something that's on our side. But it can also come together quickly, because I think one of the other heartening things is that there are a lot of young people who care a great deal. This is their top issue. They understand that they're going to be living with this. You know, they'll have to make choices about where to buy a house or which communities are going to be resilient to the effects of climate change. You know, I've already heard from friends and family members who live in California, you know, talking about, you know, where do we go? You know, what does this mean for us? You know, these kind of decisions, these kinds of issues are already in front of people. They will hopefully, and they will. I mean, I think as people then come together, they will start to affect that systematic change that needs to happen. And you know, a lot of these decisions around climate resilience are going to be community-based. They're not going to be federal. They're going to be local. So understanding the approach of your neighbors, your friends, around climate change, understanding what your elected officials feel about it, you know, it's going to be very important. But I think it's also a place where we can all affect change. I do just want to say one thing. You know, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, we would have talked about individual consumption. You know, we would have said, you know, are you recycling enough? Do you own an SUV? You know, how much meat do you eat, right? And unfortunately, I think what scientists realize, social scientists included, is that essentially picking on individual consumption decisions is, first of all, fruitless. It just doesn't make enough of an impact. And it's judgmental. So people tend to tune you out when you start questioning the kind of decisions that they're making, the kind of clothes they're buying, or the kind of cars they're driving. You know, people don't always like to hear that. And I can understand that. But I think also from an environmental education point of view, I think individual consumption choices are unfortunately a red herring. Because the amount of change and the systematic change we need is huge. It is fundamental. And this pandemic, if it has done nothing else, I hope it has shown us just an alternate vision for what kind of world we might be able to build. You know, and Rozina said this in our you know, maybe we don't want to bring up this issue but I do think it's one that, you know, people like Rozina who are doing the kind of work that they're doing, it's forefront on their mind. You know, can we build a different kind of world? And it just seems so ambitious and so difficult. But I think this pandemic has shown us that it is possible. So I hope that we take that from this.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing to what Zohra said. And there was a report that said something like, I think it's 100 companies are responsible for 70% of greenhouse gases. So yes, you know, we can rethink our individual lifestyle choices, great, but we really need systemic change. And so it speaks to that where, and I think someone also put in the comments, you know, like, and I think it goes back to these companies, right? They've done such a good job convincing us that we can, you know, it's on us to fix it when they don't have to do anything. They can continue polluting. I think that also applies to plastic, right? They've done such a good job convincing us that we just need to recycle when so many plastics are not even recyclable. They end up in trash or now in, you know, foreign countries polluting someone else's land. And so back to that environmental justice issue. But you know, yeah, this is bigger than any one person. And so I think it speaks to the need to join groups doing the work.
And to resist that greenwashing, right? Yeah, and demand real answers. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. Thank you for that. So we're going to take one more question. Given the fact that industrialization is a current reality, can we say that the world will have to live with this perpetual issue of climate change?
I hope not. You know, one of the reasons why I'm an anthropologist, I guess I'll just, it's such a big question, right? That I'll just end on a much more personal note. One of the reasons I'm an anthropologist is because I think that anthropology certainly is not the only field, but it's one of the primary fields that teaches us other ways of being in the world, other ways of measuring success, other ways of measuring well-being. And we get that perspective because the anthropologists often work with marginalized communities, and they go to communities that were subjected to colonialism, and they try to uncover ways in which these communities still retain knowledge. You know, we could call it traditional knowledge or knowledge of the environment, knowledge, I would say, of other ways of being. There is a technical term called traditional ecological knowledge, right? Where you understand how to live in your environment without trampling on it, without essentially taking a perspective that you have to dominate it. So there are other ecological philosophies. All of you mentioned I live in Kazakhstan, so the question of indigeneity is a different one. But you mentioned the tribes that lived on these lands that were colonized, and they themselves offer a perspective on nature and on the environment that might be worth reflecting on. So there are other cultures and other traditions that have found ways to exist with nature, with other species. And I'm not trying to romanticize that. I'm not saying, oh, we're going to wholesale bring back, people say, oh, so are you recommending that we all become hunters and gatherers again? No, I think to be an anthropologist is also recognize that's gone, that we're not trying to bring anything back, right? But I think the idea is that there are other definitions of the good, of success, that don't rely on profit motives, that don't rely on essentially taking from Earth more than it can give. And I mean, I'll just say that this is not this is real social science, and we have those. We have that knowledge, and we have those communities that can provide that knowledge. So going back to that listening idea, I think is very important.
And I'll just add that, yeah, I think if COVID has taught us anything, it as Zohra mentioned, we have gotten so far removed from living in harmony with nature that we've sort of unleashed this disease, and who knows what's to come. But I think if it's taught us anything, it's that we need to rethink, normal. Like, there's a lot of like, oh, can't wait to get back to normal. Well, normal wasn't working. And when we think about, economic recovery, I think we really need to prioritize climate in that post-COVID economic recovery. And, you know, it's not a matter of like, oh, are we going to prioritize green policies or the economy? It doesn't need to be this one or the other. Like it can be one and the same. And we know that climate disasters are costing us billions of dollars, millions of lives. You know, how many people die every year because of air pollution? Well, that is a result of gases in the atmosphere that shouldn't be there. And so by not acting, we are spending so much money and lives. And so we really need to rethink how we will rebuild and how we will, you know, how climate and the economy can rebuild together. So I think just, you know, the question was like, are we just going to always live with climate change? I don't think anyone knows the answer to that, because I do think in some cases we've already seen climate disasters. People have already lost their lives. Climate refugees are a thing. I think that's only projected to increase. So I think we're going to have to live with the reality of some climate change, right? Like, I think that's a reality, but what we do from here, I think is important. And I think that, I think there's a chance that we can do better moving forward.
Thank you again, Zohra and Rozina. Thank you, audience, for joining us today. Hopefully this is just the start of the critical conversation. Today was just such a treat for me, as I hope it was for all of you that are watching. So thank you again. A couple announcements before everyone leaves is you can check your registration status, get registered to vote, and more at the.ismaili/USA/vote. You can also call our hotline for support at 202-854-VOTE. Election day is November 3rd. Here are some resources shared by the panelists. It will be in your chat box. Please look out for more information on the.ismaili/USA webpage and social media pages for our young adult conversations this week and our next critical conversation. Please take the survey at the end of the session that will pop up on your screen as you leave. Thank you, and Yali Mabit.